Hello friends, today I'll be updating you with my Pantos eyeshadow progress. These are the 7 shadows that I've been working on. I have been away for 6 months, although I certainly did not make a comparable amount of progress. Let me start by showing you how the shadows are doing, then we'll chat a little bit at the end of the video about some changes I'll be making with this project moving forward. The first shadow is this light beige shade from the Balm. I have hit a good pan on it. Nearly emptied it. This is the third round for this shadow. Most of the shadows that was rolled into this project were practically untouched when I rolled them in. I used this shadow 10 times for the first round, another 7 times for the second round, which was the last update. At this point, the shadow was already really thin. I could feel that I'm almost hitting pan on it. And since the last update, I've reached for this shadow another 15 times. I think it was around the 5th usage I hit pan on this shadow. I took a picture of it and that was at end of June. And after hitting pan on it, I just kept on using it on and off. And this is how this shadow looks like now. For a total of 32 times worth of usage, I really had this shadow destroyed. I'm really glad I got such good use out of this shadow. And it will be leaving my collection from here instead of just sitting there for the longest time that it has been. Let's move on to the second shadow. Maybe I should give you guys a swatch, huh? Yeah, here is a swatch of all the shadows that is currently in this project. Moving on to the second shade, this one is also from the Balm. This is a light gold with a yellowish hue. And this is also the third round for this shadow. Here is this shadow when I wrote it in. I used it 17 times for the first round, and another 7 uses for the second round. The deep of the shadow started to become visible after the second round. And since the last update, I have reached for this shadow another 10 times. This is how this shadow looks like now. Still no pan, and I can't really tell if I made much of a progress from where I left it with the previous update. I mean, it all depends on how I use it, right? If we're counting one-time use as one usage, using the shadow on the inner corner is quite different when comparing to using it all over the eyelid. Either way, I still think it's fairly reasonable for me to predict I will be hitting pan on this shadow in the next 2 updates, as long as I just keep on using it. Next is this gunmetal shade from Sephora. This is what I'm wearing today on my Ultra V. I paired with the pink shade from the Urban Decay palette that I'm also panning. It's not really the typical ways I'll be wearing this shadow, but it was a fun look to do. This is the first round for this shadow. I wrote this shadow in from the previous update. This is how this shadow looked like when I wrote it in. I think it was in the beginning of the year, way over 6 months ago. Frankly, I did not touch this shadow since I wrote it in. I only began using this shadow very recently, and I reached for this a total of 5 times. And this is how this shadow looks like now. I don't suppose you can tell any difference. I mean, it's only from 5 uses, and within that 5 uses, I was only using it a little. Sometimes I would use it as a liner or very subtly on the outer corner of my eye. None of that requires a lot of product to be used. The fourth shadow is this bronzy shade from KVD. This is the third round for this shadow. For some reason, I found this shadow really hard to pan. Aside from the size of the pan, I still find this shadow very hard to pan. Here's this shadow when I first wrote it in, almost untouched. I used this shadow 15 times for the first round, 7 times for the second round. You can tell on one side of the shadow, there is already a very shallow dent is starting to take place. It is indeed a very shallow dent. From me touching the shadow between my fingers, I am sure I'm still very far from hitting the pan. Since my last update, I've worn this shadow 8 times. That makes it a total of 30 times I have reached for this shadow since I wrote it in. And this shadow still looks like almost nothing has been done to it. I took a look of my other shadows, right? At the 30 usage mark, most of the other shadows would show up with a significant dent. But with this one, it does not even compare. This one is gonna last. Moving to the next one, this deep cranberry shade is also from the Balm. This is the third round for this shadow. However, I have barely managed to reach for this shadow since I wrote it in. I reached for it once for the first round and another one time for the second round. And since my last update, I kind of have forced myself to reach for this shadow twice. Really, there's not much of a usage for this shadow. I'm actually gonna roll this shadow out because I was and I'm still feeling very uninspired to reach for this shadow. I'm gonna be putting this one back to my shadow bank and maybe wait for another time to roll this shadow back into this project. Next is this mauve shade from Lancome. The second round for this shadow. Here's how this shadow looked when I wrote it in. I used it twice for the first round, no visible difference. And I reached for this another 4 times since then, all as a blush. I haven't really tried this shadow on my eye yet. I don't assume you can tell if there's any change, but when I feel the surface with my finger, Well, I have to really feel it, but there is a little dent. That is a good sign for my own assurance. Okay, that leaves us with the last shadow, this mid-tone brown from the Balm. This is a very neutral toned brown. Well, I can use it as a bronzer or as a crease transition shade. Basically a very useful shade. However, I only reached for this shadow once for its first round. And since my last update, I have reached for this shadow shy of 3 times. So not much has changed, but I will 100% focus on this shadow a little bit more in the next updates. Always said, if I want to hit pan on this shadow, it should be fairly easy. I have plenty of ways I can use the shadow up. Alright, that is all the progress update. Evidently, I did not make much of a progress for most of the shadows, considering this is supposed to be a 6-month worth of usage. The biggest reason is likely because I have too much eyeshadow I'm trying to work on at the same time. I have 2 eyeshadows in my project pan, a palette from Urban Decay I'm trying to pan. By the way, update for that is coming. And I also have my Elimination project, where I focus on testing bunch of eyeshadows to pick out the ones that I could potentially let go of. Altogether, at any given time, I'm expected to be working on 40 pans of eyeshadows, based on how often I wear makeup, which is on average 3 to 4 times a week. And say every time I will use 2 shadows. Consequently, it'll take me about 5 to 6 weeks to give each shadow a one-time use. That is pretty insane. But it also explains to why I have been feeling I'm not making the progress I intended to. That being said, moving forward, I'll be panning 6 shadows instead of 7. I know it's not life-changing, but I'll make the small changes and work my steps from there. Plus, since my shadow bank, I'm referring to all the shadows I want to be panning, had grown sufficiently, instead of me choosing which shadow I want to pan next, I would like to be using the automatic number generator to randomize the shadow that I'll be working on. I figured that would have a positive effect, hopefully leaving me feeling inspired and motivated to be reaching for the shadows more. As for today, I need to be rolling in 1 shadow. These are all the shadows that are currently in my shadow bank. And the unique number the generator gave to me is 15, which is corresponding to this dark brown shade from Too Faced that I just brought into my shadow bank last week. That is really cool. This is a swatch of all the 6 shadows. Quite a wholesome color story. I am thrilled to be using it already. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.